go ahead and get started. We're about 5 past the hour. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining on, a 7 p.m. Eastern on a just a random Thursday. So it's definitely inspiring to see folks who are just passionate and interested in sustainability. I'll just give a little background on this talk. My name is Trevor Cohen, and I write about hope at the edge of the climate crisis. I spent the last 5 years interviewing innovators and activists who are really building the foundation for a sustainable society. And the culmination of that work and the interviews I did culminated into this book known as Bright Green Future, which goes across many different sectors from energy, industry, and cities and farms, and provides stories and examples of people who have really envisioned a sustainable society at kind of the level of their community or within their industry. They may not be at the level of state government changing everything. In some cases they are, but in many cases they've kind of articulated what a vision for a sustainable world might look like with practical examples through different organizations they've started or startups and technologies, as well as kind of different community development projects. So I'm gonna share that throughout. And yeah, so I've been hosting this talk with a number of different areas to really bring together expertise as well as ideas and thinking that is really unique to each place and each region. We each possess really unique knowledge and wisdom from the places that we live and the places we interact with and the places we love. And it's something in writing the book was seeing kind of that unique wisdom through the people I talk to, but it's now even almost a more rewarding experience to have this conversation, these conversations with folks throughout the country, like people like you who show up to stuff like this. And so, yeah, but, I must confess, sometimes in the environmental movement, I feel a little like a hopeless romantic. The seas are rising, the land is drying out. We've got a firestorm in one season and then a polar vortex in the next. But, instead of tuning it all out, instead of watching Netflix on the couch at the end of our busy days, we're here in meetings like this, staring straight into the heart of this seemingly hopeless situation. Because we're determined to fix this mess. We believe that not only can we stop the destruction of our planet, but at the same time, create a better world than the one we live in now. But people outside this environmental movement or sustainability might see this as merely idealistic, but I believe we have a secret that makes our dreams much more realistic than they may appear. And our secret is that we think differently. We know that we can't solve the climate crisis with the same thinking that caused it. And so we view the future through a different lens. Often the way we conceptualize a crisis defines how we respond to it. And so in that spirit, I would like to ask you all here a question to learn from your wisdom as folks involved in sustainability, as well as to better understand your visions of the future. And so my question to you all is, what types of thinking do you feel we need to break free from our fossil fueled economy and envision a truly sustainable society? And so you can either jump right in, either raise your hand or jump in just saying your thoughts on this, or put your response into the chat and I will try to get to you. This question, it's really about we obviously have to make some very huge changes to reshape our economy to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And a big part of that is the thinking behind it, of how we conceptualize the issues we face in order to shape the different responses and solutions that we have. And so, yeah, would love to hear some of your thoughts around the thinking change that needs to happen. Looks like Becca from Sustainable Midland says determined, holistic, and committed. Yeah, I like those three a lot, around sticking with it through how challenging it is, as well as thinking holistic at the same time and thinking about systemically about how things interact together rather than solely focused on one thing, and really like the commitment that it takes in order to think holistically. It's harder to do that, to think holistically. As easy it is to say, like, okay, we need to think holistically about something, it's harder to actually kind of pull that off. And so that determination and commitment is really important. Thanks for sharing that. Any other thoughts from folks? Looks like we have Tanya says focusing on all three aspects of sustainability: social, environmental, and economical. Yeah, that's also really important. It is, sustainability is really an ultimate multi-sector, multi-system word, in that involves how we act socially and cultural norms around how we value different things in our environment and how we interact with nature. It involves how we actually create policies around the natural world in the environmental policy sense, and it involves the shape of our economy and its impact of commerce on the natural world. So thanks for sharing that. Sophie Conrad, and I see your hand, Bob. I'll call you after this. Sophie Conrad says, like you said, I think that the first step in sustainability is believing it's possible and that it offers new opportunities. Too often, our lawmakers don't consider the progress sustainable living can bring rather than the work it will take to get there. Yeah, you're speaking my language, Sophie. We really do have this opportunity to envision a better world rather than solely trying to avoid disaster or mitigate something. And often, you know, in the political and kind of high level discourse in the media, it's so tempting and so easy to get wrapped up in this, like, oh, it's going to be so hard, and here's all the bad things that are happening from the planet, and then here's all the bad things that we have, all the sacrifices we have to make to change. But like you said here, it really is an opportunity to build something better and to step back and really critically think about, like, what do we want our cities to look like? What do we want our food systems to look like? So yeah, that's super important. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, Bob, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I
Go
did.
ahead.
I've been reading your book, by the way. Thanks for
Oh,
sending that. And it's really interesting. But I think the word that I wanted to throw into the mix was empathy, deep empathy, and I mean that both toward all other human beings, but also toward the planet that we live on and the nature that we depend on and all of that. I I think we can get really wrapped up in thinking about systems and all of that kind of stuff. And I do that all the time. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't be thinking about that, but I think that getting in touch with something deeper underneath it is really important. And that is this sense of connection between ourselves and each other and the rest of the planet. Um, because I think that's the disconnected thinking is really what's gotten us into this mess, into this thought that we can do whatever we want without having to be concerned about the consequences or the effects on other people or on uh, other parts of nature and whatever. So empathy, I think, is just the place where we cultivate that sense of connection.
yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Bob. It's interesting to think about how, like, that interaction between, like, the economic systems we have in them being non-conducive to empathy in some ways. by like really segmenting and separating in kind of a large global economy, the impact that we have on things, and like directly seeing that, like our ancestors saw like it, when the majority of us were farmers, saw like the impact that they would have from like the things that they ate and from the things that they and the animals that they cared for. And we've really been able to separate ourselves from that through these economic systems. So I'm really interested in like how do we add more empathy into these systems in our lives. And I think it obviously starts with, you know what you did of like bringing that up, of saying like we need to focus on um, how other people are affected by us, as well as like a deep kind of almost like quasi or really real spiritual care for all different, for nature, for the people around us, for the animals in our life, for the animals that are like separated from us, but in the areas we live, affected by our lifestyles and different ways of living and being. And yeah, and then kind of the greater landscape as well, kind of empathy for, on a larger scale, the ecosystems that support us, that we wouldn't be able to live without oxygen from trees. And so in a weird unconscious way, like there's empathy towards us in being able to live on this planet. And so giving back empathy is, it's almost like paying it forward. But yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Bob. Cool. Anyone else want to jump in or put any thoughts in the chat? All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing. We're going to I'll get into the presentation, and then we'll also have a Q&A at the end as well. And Sustainable 9 says actionable. Yeah, that's also important. Like, we can be having this conversation forever, but if there's no actually outcomes or anything real from it, then where's it getting us? So thank you for that as well. So before we dive in, I think a crucial part of envisioning a sustainable society, especially in the United States, is acknowledging the wisdom of indigenous peoples that has been systematically dismissed, devalued, and appropriated by colonialism. For millennia, landscapes on this continent have been shaped by human activity. But in many ways, this alteration was done to provide abundant resources for thousands of years, with attention to the health of local ecologies. As we draw inspiration from the past, our challenge is to adapt these ways of thinking to the realities of our modern world. It's also important to acknowledge how our current economy has affected Black folks, people of color, and white folks who live near polluting facilities, power plants, and mines. We hope to bring to the fore their wisdom and visions for sustainable society through some of the examples in this presentation. And so really some of the basis of this presentation and this conversation came out of the conversations that I had over the last 5 years with about 200 different folks who are working on different climate change solutions. And out of those conversations, I noticed really these three common types of thinking, or principles and ways of doing things that many of them shared in the way they approach their work. And so I wanted to share these three different types of thinking, many of which you've already kind of touched on already in your observations and your contributions. I wanted to share them with you to really add to your repertoire of sustainable design thinking, as well as to provide some concrete examples of what it looks like to act on these different types of thinking and incorporate them into very real work. And so these different types of common approaches in talking to folks are threefold. First off is systems thinking, which is at the level of analysis of how we look at the problem. And it's really all about finding the deeper patterns that are hiding in plain sight. It's looking beyond the surface level at one issue that we might see going on, and what are all of the connectivities to that issue with throughout that's kind of leading to a common pattern within the system. It's also thinking very, very crucially and importantly on community, and really embracing local people as the beneficiaries of change. It's the kind of the level of focus being that on the community, and really empathy for folks in our community, as well as, part of that empathy is being able to listen to people and what their vision is for the future, what the challenges that they're facing are, um, in order to create a vision that makes folks in all of the diverse places throughout the world the beneficiaries of change. We all have to have a lot of change in order in order to move towards a sustainable economy, but it's really important to root that in communities, and what each location and the folks there really need and value. And then thirdly is regeneration, which can be defined in many different ways. But I define regeneration thinking in this context around creating systems and communities that grow stronger and healthier over time, that rather than degrade with each passing year or season, they become more resilient and able to respond better to crises and challenges, as well as better able to benefit from opportunities that present themselves. So regeneration is really about these systems and communities getting stronger and kind of reinforcing themselves. So we'll start first with systems thinking. You know, in a nutshell, systems thinking is all about interconnectedness and how multiple issues overlap and intersect, rather than looking at them as solely disparate things that need to be tackled separately. It's at looking at things as, rather than linear as going from point A to point B and ending there, but instead looking at point B and how it starts and how it connects back to point A and the next cycle, then the next cycle. It's about seeing things emerging all at once and emerging in a kind of a same kind of soup or primordial soup, rather than as solely as silos separately. And it's, ultimately about looking at the whole rather than solely the parts. I wanted to give an example of really the difference between a traditional reductionist thinking approach versus a systems thinking approach. I like to call this example the parable of the techie and the farmer, because it has to do with a conversation that I had with, I guess you would call him a serial entrepreneur, when I used to live in San Francisco. And he'd started, 5 companies. He had a million ideas going around in his head about how to hack and solve all these different problems. He was clearly very brilliant, and had a really great conversation with him. And some point in the conversation, we started talking about climate change. And he really made the point that regenerative organic farming, or trying to use farming to focus on soil health and sequester carbon in the soil, was completely pointless. He said that if we really wanted to sequester carbon in the ground, then we shouldn't be trying to plant and have healthier farms that have a better impact on the soil. We should be just putting a giant direct air capture machine on that land. And we could sequester way more carbon per acre if we had this giant carbon capture machine, and then grow everything in vertical farms and in warehouses and skyscrapers. And we would be much more efficient at getting these outcomes we wanted, and these optimizing these different metrics. From a traditional thinking, reductionist thinking approach, he was right in some sense. Yeah, you could probably sequester more carbon with a direct air capture machine than with a regenerative organic farm. But if you look at it from a systems or holistic perspective, it the argument you start to see that really the only benefit of a direct air capture machine is sequestering carbon. Whereas with a regenerative organic farm, not only can you sequester some carbon in the soil, but at the same time grow healthy food, store water better during times of drought, store more water during times of flood, kind of acting as a water management system and flood management through the way we're stewarding the landscape, as well as provide in some cases in smaller farms a direct connection between people in a community and the food system that sustains us, and to learn more about where our food comes from, what it looks like, and kind of reinforce that connection that makes us as individuals in a society and part of a community, as increases our ecological knowledge to have these places. And so you start to see this argument looks a little silly from a holistic perspective when you just want to put a giant carbon capture machine on the land, rather than all of these other benefits that can happen from looking at the same problem from a holistic perspective, a systems perspective. Taking a step back, we start to see the pattern that we have across the economy that we've created and the society we've created, where the way we design both cities and farms really resembles in many ways a monoculture. In our cities, we focus on optimizing residential in one area, optimizing commerce with big strip malls in one area, and then everything that's made in a completely separate area. And we do the same with farms. We optimize soy production in one area, wheat in another, animals in another space, really concentrated. And while this system is very good at maximizing certain metrics, the metric of housing, the metric of soy, um, at the same time, it sacrifices the benefits that come from mixing these different things together. Um, from the benefits that come from a neighborhood that mixes all of, not just focusing on the metrics of housing, but the mix of housing next to a place where you live, where you live being close to a place where you work and you shop and you have all these other connections with people around you and build community, and all the benefits that comes from a vibrant neighborhood. And then also you sacrifice the health of the soil in an agricultural sense when you're kind of basically cutting off the nutrient cycle that happens when you mix and rotate different crops, and then bring in animals as an interaction with that nutrient cycle, so that you can build health of the soil as well as producing food that ends up being in some cases more nutrient dense. And so I wanted to share an example of what it looks like to combine both of these things and really approach both the city and the farm in a holistic way. And so this is an example of a community in Gilbert, Arizona. And like a lot of communities, especially in the Southwest, where they're rapidly growing and expanding out into the countryside, um, there was a family farm known as the Johnston Family Farm that was approached by a developer. And they initially wanted to basically just put a residential subdivision in their neighborhood and maybe a few strip malls. And the family, they said they didn't want to do that. They said if they're going to sell their farm, they wanted to do something different. They wanted to preserve, in some sense, the sense of community that used to exist in neighborhoods throughout cities and small towns throughout the United States. And so they worked very closely with the developers to do something different. And so they built a mixed use community that centered around a regenerative organic farm. And in the sense that residents get to access produce, vegetables, and fruit and herbs from the farm. as well as get to live close to a number of different places to eat and places um, to build community in their area. They What they did is they converted the old tractor shed on the farm, which is this kind of like half cylinder building, um, into a space for different craft makers and breweries, and other kind of smaller pop-up restaurants, and a co-working space to kind of be an incubator for places for new people to start new ventures, as well as provide really cool things in the neighborhood for people to interact with. At the same time, they converted the old farmhouse into a restaurant. They made a coffee shop. And in doing so, they really created a destination in the area. Where people come to visit kind of on the weekend, where kind of normally people might have just driven by it. Um, and they also paid attention to how they mix in the residential sense, different types of life and different phases of our lives and different types of community, rather than solely having a residential neighborhood with single family homes for new families, or a neighborhood that's focused on college grads or college students. And instead, they mixed single family homes with multifamily apartments, a senior living facility, a school, to really combine all of these different types of life within one neighborhood. And in creating that destination, the farm provides produce to the residents, um, as well as the restaurant, and as well as other restaurants and grocery places in the community, as well as it's also an event space where people can hold different events, as well as some people get married there. And so in doing this, they created, and looking at mixing all of these different things, created something that ended up having all these other benefits that it wouldn't have if you just focused on getting the most out of a residential area and most out of a commercial area. And so, secondly, we also come to community thinking, which is really all about shifting the benefits of change to community. If we look at the fossil fuel industry, while we of course benefit from being able to drive and getting electricity from fossil fuel power plants, they at the same time, the vast majority of the benefit from that goes to fossil fuel companies and to utilities, while polluting the surrounding neighborhoods, as well as destroying and putting uh, putting out of balance our larger climatic systems. And so really the beneficiaries are quite limited from the sense of the traditional fossil fuel industry. And with renewables, as we kind of move towards more distributed renewables with wind and solar, we're starting to see all of these new models start to arise around how can we, we're going to move to more renewables, but how can we also shift the benefit of change to more people and to the communities where those different power generating systems exist. And so one example that we have in California is known as community choice. And really what it is it allows cities and counties to band together to basically choose where their energy is sourced from in their communities. They can choose that we want X amount of solar, we want X amount of wind or hydro, and we want to um, phase out uh, coal and natural gas and different timescales, um, as well as choose where the excess revenue that's generated from us buying electricity goes to. And so in many cases, they use that excess revenue to start different community projects, as well as, and sometimes just give it back to ratepayers as a dividend. and also at the same time really focus on lowering costs from electricity, focusing less on projects that will just kind of generate more profit. And we see that this case in many different utilities. I think in South Carolina, there was an issue with a nuclear plant um, around really just, that never got finished, that, us as ratepayers end up paying for that, and paying for the mistakes of these large utility monopolies. And so really focusing on how do we also reduce costs for ratepayers to make electricity more affordable. And in many cases, they end up lowering the bills by 15 to 30%. And while this started in really just one county, it expanded where now there's over 20 different community choice organizations that all kind of adapt to the local needs in the area and kind of the local energy landscape that's unique to each area, as well as try to focus on local jobs. And, if we're going to be building all these renewables, how do we provide a living wage, as well as hire over half of people who are building are these new projects from the local workforce, and really stimulating the economy in the area at the same time. And now community choice makes up like half of the energy that's consumed in the state is through one of these community choice programs. And so it really did, start in one location that was unique to it, but expanded to all of these different kind of unique locations. And there's so many different cool new models that are coming up with renewables to really distribute the benefits of change to communities. Including community solar and different co-op renewable projects. It is really cool the opportunities we have from this shift towards renewables. And community thinking is really all about adapting solutions to local needs and visions. This is an example in West Virginia and Appalachia, um, where this organization known as Coalfield Development, um, they train laid off coal miners to transform old surface mines into food forests. So in many cases, these used to be mountains that were blown apart, or large open pit mines. And what they do is they take a stone crusher machine and grind up all of the old rocks and boulders and pickaxes. And then they start planting different cover crops and bring in like hardy pigs and goats and livestock to really create this new soil, which they grow these food forests on top of agroforestry food forests, to train folks in regenerative farming and provide new jobs and income. And this is really just one part of many different enterprises, social enterprises that they've created, that seek to create a more diverse economy after the collapse of coal. And it's really precarious to base our economy on one commodity, that being coal. And now that coal is on the decline, it's really left a gaping hole in the economy throughout a lot of different parts of Appalachia. And so what they seek to do is really create this new renewable and diverse economy. They started a construction company that builds affordable housing. They acquired a t-shirt maker that makes apparel for Major League Baseball out of recycled materials. They started a solar company. They have also like a furniture company and craft company. And they kind of collaborate in this economic ecosystem in some ways, where they'll harvest some of the old materials from the mine, old wood and old kind of parts to use in the new housing that they build, as well as in some of the crafts that they make. And everyone who's part of this, who works for one of these enterprises, receives a free 2-year associate's degree, as well as different counseling and professional development to really regenerate the economy in the area, as well as people's skills and kind of confidence to create this new renewable economy in one place that was beholden to one costly commodity. And they've also really rooted it it's started by West Virginians and really rooted it in Appalachian values, of what they refer to as gumption, grit, and grace, which is they really see as these values which folks have, in that area, have been able to make a living off pretty challenging country for centuries, and really taken that knowledge of being able to build things really well, reuse things really well, of determination, of the kind of sticking with it that we are going to need if we're going to really respond to the climate crisis and our environmental challenges. And so also really celebrating these local values in the area, as well as providing a a way for all of us to learn from all of these unique knowledge that exists throughout all of our communities throughout the country, and even at the world at large. So this is another example in on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. And this is a really cool example of using both systems thinking and combining it with community thinking. It started with a number of different indigenous Lakota activists and community builders on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And how they started is they really took a step back and thinking, rather than just latching on to one problem and trying to fix it immediately, they spent several years just through town halls and interviewing people, and inviting people in their communities, in order to figure out what was their vision for the future, what were the challenges that they faced, as well as what did they want for their children, what did they want for their grandchildren, what was the world they wanted to live in. And so they combined really all of the challenges that folks were facing with all of the kind of hopes and dreams and visions that they had. And from it, they created this what they term a regenerative community development. And it addresses kind of these multiple issues at the same time in this one development. They looked and they saw that there was a huge housing crisis on the reservation, where in some cases as many as 15 people were living in trailer homes that are kind of no more than 2 bedrooms. They saw there was massive unemployment, up to 70% in some communities. There was a food crisis where very limited access to healthy food, where 99% of the food was brought in from outside of the community. And so through this one project, they tried to address all these things at once in a systemic way, rather than solely kind of looking at them in silos and trying to, either hand out food in one case, or have job training in another sense. And so what they did was they built housing by training youth in construction. In many cases where some of the people who had learned construction in this program from the community ended up being first-time homeowners in the houses that they built. They built houses, they built apartments, and they seek to have as many as 900 people living within this development that they built. And they also at the center built a regenerative organic farm that has an egg program that provides eggs to people who need it in the community, as well as throughout all of the different supermarkets and even gas stations and places where people access food, where they might not have had healthy eggs before. In addition to kind of many different vegetables and fruit, and native choke cherries and other native herbs, and food that had been part of their diet for many years, that had been lost during colonialism. And they also built a community center that includes different skill-based classes, including financial literacy and kind of learning other different skills, in addition to cultural revitalization, like Lakota language classes, Lakota food classes, and learning how to make traditional dishes, and then a number of different other ceremonies. And it really created this both a place for people to live, learn new skills and jobs, as well as gather in the community. And from this, they were contacted by like 70 different other Native American communities who wanted to do something similar. And the founder actually went on to start a more national organization focused on really expanding this beyond just this one community on Pine Ridge. Um, and and they also really rooted a lot of their design in how they treat it, like their urban design and how they plan things in, traditionally how they used to camp, how Lakota used to camp and set up their different settlements, and they built their houses kind of in this circle around one common gathering space, and then thought about how everything is connected, and how you get to different common spaces through the design of the place. And it's interesting, we often for sustainable city design look back to Europe as a model for the walkable city, and how do we recreate Paris in the United States. But there's also a tremendous amount of indigenous wisdom about how people have been creating settlements and different urban spaces for millennia on this continent. So it brings out kind of a additional knowledge and wisdom for how we think about, on the larger sense, building and forming our cities and our different places we live. So lastly, we come to regeneration or regenerative thinking. And regeneration can be thought of in many different senses. Often we talk about regeneration from an agricultural perspective or a land perspective. This is an organization known as Regen Ag Alliance out of Minnesota that their founder, Reginaldo Hazlet Marroquin, he grew up in Guatemala. His family were farmers, and he was, obviously he throughout his life had struggled with hunger and really being able to grow enough food. But at the same time, he saw the rainforest around him, and how it almost seemed to provide effortlessly food for millions upon billions of different organisms throughout different trophic levels, and was able to do it almost effortlessly, and was really inspired by the rainforest. And he studied farming for many different years at in through different farming schools, and eventually ended up in the United States, where he developed a permaculture system that combines chickens with fruit trees and nut trees, as well as a number of different other crops, in a way that integrates this nutrient cycle. And he thinks of things kind of in this, rather as an acre as being 40,000 some odd square feet, as being kind of a cubic space where you have trees going 15 feet up, or roots going 10 feet down, or even further than that. And thinking about like how do we recharge the soil, and the energy system within the soil, and the nutrient system within the soil, as kind of like looking at the soil battery, so that every year we start off with needing less inputs and are able to get more out of that system. And he designed this permaculture system to be within an acre and a half to 3 acres, with a lower barrier of entry. And he trains migrant farm workers on how to start their own farming ventures through this system. And in the United States, over 70 or about, I think, 68% of all farm laborers are migrant farm workers. And so he wanted to provide this opportunity to enter and be able to kind of start something on their own in the agricultural system, and to do it using all of this wisdom and advantage from working with nature rather than solely against it. We can also think about regeneration from the sense of materials. This is a startup out of British Columbia that works on regenerating e-waste, and providing kind of a full spectrum recycling for our old electronics. a founder really looked at how we think and conceptualize our economy around really producing the next big gadget every 6 months to a year, and then throw away everything, kind of the last year's model. And we have this tech industry that's really based on what's the next big thing. And the collateral damage of that is that a lot of our e-waste ends up in the developing world, where it ends up polluting different communities where folks work on trying to extract the precious metals from our old electronics in often toxic conditions. And so what Ronin 8 developed is they repurposed a technology which is essentially a massive tuning fork. And they repurposed it from the mining sector, which used to be used to separate out tailings, metals from mine tailings. And what they do is they grind up our old electronics in water, and they use sound energy from this tuning fork to separate out the fiberglass from all of the metals, and then all the metals from themselves, the copper from the tin, the silver, the lead, the gold, the palladium, and then all these rare earth elements, where many of them either end up in the trash or extracted in a really toxic way. And in doing so, they've really been able to create a circular system for almost in a periodic table's worth of metals. Um, and in a larger sense, thinking about from how do we envision industry as an ecosystem where plants at the end of their lives of converting solar energy into carbohydrates, which feed the basis of ecosystems. At the end of their lives, when they die, they don't pollute the soil; they become nutrients for the soil. And so, thinking about our renewable energy production in the same way. So, looking at solar and our batteries is kind of like a plant where at the end of their useful lives of capturing energy from the sun and translating that into electricity which powers our modern society, at the end of a lithium ion battery's life, really being able to capture and recycle all of the different materials in kind of endless loops to provide the nutrients or feedstock for the next generation, a next generation of products. And they've really focused on like, how do we regenerate lithium ion batteries? And that's really one thing they're focused on now. And I think partnering with a number of different larger producers to do that, as well as solar panels too, and being able to recycle them for the next system. And so lastly, regeneration, I think even most importantly, can be thought about regenerating people and really regenerating our confidence and ability to face the challenges that we have. And so this is an example of a farm outside of Albany, New York, known as Soulfire Farm. And what they do is, in addition to growing healthy food, which they have a CSA program, they have a number of different classes where they train Black and Indigenous farmers in permaculture skills, in construction skills, in community building skills, to start their own farms as well, and kind of go on to start their own community farms to bring this connection to food, to food production, to eating healthy food, as well as kind of a connection to nature and having a safe and natural space throughout communities across the country, and really have started this kind of train the trainer of movement of community and community-minded regenerative organic farmers that have an impact in shaping the lives of young people in their communities, as well as folks who have lived there a long time, in what they think is possible, and kind of what you can celebrate in this connection with nature, as well as kind of connection with the people around you. And so really, at the end of the day, we come to like, how do we regenerate our human spirit and our confidence in ability to tackle these massive challenges in front of us. And so that's the end of my presentation. You can go deeper if you want to explore some of the the concepts that I discussed in this presentation in the book. If on brightgreenfuture.com, you can get a signed copy of the book and get 15% off with promo code Envision. I go deeper into a lot of these different concepts and kind of look at multi-sector energy industry, cities and farms, and how do we create regenerative systems across all of these different areas. And then through the stories of people who are kind of working on practical examples. So it's really kind of in a storytelling sense. And also, if you want to get in touch with me, I'd love to chat. If you have feedback for me, thoughts you want to share, just want to chat, or collaboration ideas, you can reach me at trevor@brightgreenfuture.com. So we have a few minutes left, and I just wanted to open that up for any comments, thoughts, questions people have, or reactions to the presentation, or any kind of thing that came up for you all.
I have a question for Tanya.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so in the chat, she says she's in USC Sustainable Carolina program, focusing on all three aspects of sustainability: the social, environmental, and economic. Can you tell me a bit about it? Is this like a degree program, or is it a club, or? Or anybody else who might, I think that there are a couple of people in the Sustainable Carolina program at USC. So anyone who might, because I quickly looked online and I'm just curious to know more than the blurb that USC had.
Looks like Tanya says it is the student branch of our sustainability office.
Okay.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it. Thanks for your contributions earlier. I see also a question from Sustainable Midlands from Becca. Do you know if there are any initial inspiration for that developmental design you just showed us? And if so, where? Were you referring to the one from Agritopia, from the first one I showed?
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, I kind of had a follow-up to that question. I think you were still presenting when you were when I asked that question. And I don't know, maybe you know the answer to that, or maybe it was just like we're dreaming up on the spot, and you know, before we sell our land and our farm, you know, let's kind of change the way we think about what's going to happen to it. Or if there was, you know, kind of an impetus or an inspo, you know, for them. And, you know, kind of to piggyback off of that question in terms of, you know, revisiting development and what that might mean and what it might look for sustainably minded development, what would you say about, you know, things that are already kind of set in stone, so to speak, and, you know, kind of like speaking on, you know, the massive acreage of soybean, or the massive, you know, these, you know, pop-up plastic house developments, you know, kind of what could you speak to in terms of things that are already, you know, already here, already kind of brick and mortar? I don't know. I was kind of thinking about those two thoughts.
Yeah, great question. That's a lot to unpack, but I'll do my best. To your first question around like where their inspiration came from, and kind of what thoughts went into that. You know, and I think this speaks to like the inspiration for sustainable design can come from anywhere. They were like very, they actually looked a lot at the family was very religious and Christian, and looked actually a lot at like biblical principles in terms of within their design, about like how do we create a lifestyle in our communities that's not based on things, but it's based on people and spiritual connection to people and a spiritual connection to our community. And so like that was like, and they even like on their website have a principles thing where they talk about kind of the biblical connection to sustainable urban design. But when they like, think about designing the neighborhood, they look at a lot of these different principles of new urbanism around, facing having houses with front porches, so you're kind of faced towards the street, interacting with your neighbors. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a ton of different, if you're familiar with that world of new urbanism, of different design, really cool design strategies for the physical design of stuff. I like that you brought up, like, what do we do with the stuff that's already been built? That is the really big challenge we have. Like, we've built so much car dependent sprawl throughout the United States, and it is admittedly extremely expensive to redesign that and make it walkable. If there is some really cool stuff around called kind of the suburban retrofit, or kind of re-envisioning suburbia around, like, how do you change a dying mall into like a multi use neighborhood. There's some really cool stuff, like Galiana Tachieva, who has some really cool thinking on that. And then June Williamson, and I'm forgetting the other one, Ellen Dunham Jones, have a lot of cool stuff around like the physical design of that. It's really expensive to do, in the sense of, like, converting an old strip mall. It's just like a lot of material that has to be moved. But there are some really cool examples, actually. And there's one in Colorado where they transformed basically this old mall that was dead into a mixed use, like, walkable neighborhood. I think it's called Belmar or something, and it is in the book, but it's, yeah, one example. There's many different examples of this, but I guess from a practical perspective, because it is so expensive, like, starting first with the existing walkable areas that were made unwalkable over time, through car dependent thinking placed on non-walkable places, is way more affordable to, like, make small changes where the actual design was initially set up for that. Yeah, I think this, what really inspires me is, like, the strong towns movement. I don't know if you might be familiar with that, which is really like kind of like small town bottom up urbanism. It's really a growing and robust movement, around, like, thinking about how do we create both economically sustainable as well as environmentally sustainable places, because a big strip mall requires a ton more pipes, to uh, we some places we have 10 times the amount of pipes we used to have, in order to support these big box store buildings in smaller towns, and ends up putting towns into debt. And so we have this opportunity to, sustainable urban design is also sustainably economic from a financial perspective for cities.
It is, yeah. And did you say that was the strong towns movement?
Strong towns, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I know this is not, on such a holistic level, but, I have a friend I was speaking with, and, he really needs to save money. And I was like, look, I mean, even on a personal level, if you're living sustainably, you're saving money, even if it's just in your own home, so if you think about on an infrastructure level, development level, repurpose, all of those things. I mean, it makes financial sense too, as well as, making environmental, sense, long term. So I think that, kind of thinking back to some of the things you touched on, it's like very much a holistic thing, and it all kind of connects.
Yeah, I mean, I think and that's a good point. Like, there's a myth that I think our economy tells us around, like, the way it's set up now is the most efficient way. And it's like, the best way. And if we wanted to make it more sustainable, it would be less efficient or less good for us. But no, it's set up to maximize profits for the actors who are most able to manipulate the political system, in different areas, and take advantage of different opportunities that present themselves with the resources they have. And so, it's like we've taken the design of the mall, which is like which is designed to really funnel you through the most amount of shops as possible to extract the most from you, and applied that, on a larger scale to our cities, in the way that, things get passed in city councils and approved are based off of, these economic interests, from actually a relatively few actors, and end up creating, a situation which is less efficient, on the whole for folks, and less financially sustainable. Yeah, our crumbling infrastructure, Mary says, our crumbling infrastructure shows us the problem we have. Yes, exactly. It's a proof point. Like, why is our infrastructure getting a D rating, from the Society of Civil Engineers? It's because we've overbuilt, and we've built things that are way more expensive than we can actually repair. And so, that, in a sense, like, because we've done that, it's the reason why we don't replace pipes that leach lead into the water, because we're burdened with trying to maintain all this other stuff. So that kind of stuff gets put on hold for kind of the next shiny thing, which we can't necessarily afford to support. And yeah, it's all connected. Thank you. Yeah, I know we're at time, but again, if anyone has any final questions before we wrap up, I'd be happy to, or any questions, not for me, but for other folks too.
Would you maybe just be able to speak a little bit on, and this is obviously, I just don't know where you could even start with this, but the intersection of social justice and environmental justice, and kind of thinking about again how these things are just so related. I mean, is there anything that initially pops into your head or into your heart, when you think of that cross section, I mean, because I think they go so hand in hand, and again, it's just such a, I don't know, I don't really know where you would begin with something like that. And I'm sure if I read the book, I would, be able to, you could elaborate on that in your book. But I mean, what would you kind of maybe just have a few words to kind of speak to that?
Yeah, thanks for that question too. Yeah, I mean, the intersection is very strong in the sense that, like, decisions we've made to destroy the planet have also been are exploitative decisions, from a both environmental sense as well as a social sense, in the sense that we have excluded certain people from the benefits of the economy that we've created. And I think, from a environmental justice or climate justice perspective, um, where the part that inspires me is folks who have looked at the wisdom as the challenges that they faced in their areas, and developed approaches to solving those. And it's really, I think it's important to connect the resources that are being distributed at the higher levels, at a federal level, at a state level, at city level. Connect that with folks who have the knowledge of, from communities that have been disproportionately affected by the existing fossil fuel economy, to connect their visions and their projects and their strategies with the resources, that are being allocated at a higher level. Some of the examples I shared, for example, Thunder Valley, in Pine Ridge Reservation, which is one of the poorest counties in America, they receive funding from the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development. Or also Coalfield Development receives funding from grants at the state level in West Virginia. And so, like, I think it's a good start. I think we could be doing a lot more in making sure that the really the change that we create is rooted in what people actually need in their areas, and also allowing people, those people who are already leaders in their communities, to be connected more with those resources, um, at a higher level, and how we think about distributing resources. Like, we distribute so much resources right now to a handful of companies. Like, what if we just, what if, we had $1 trillion for all of these like small projects, that, while we have this issue around scalability. Like, a lot of people ask me like, how do you scale all this stuff? It's like, well, you don't want to scale it from like a one size fits all perspective, but you want to provide the resources for a renaissance to occur, where all these local leaders can do really what makes the most sense for their communities, rather than, we've wasted trillions of dollars on projects that don't actually make sense for for communities, and really thinking critically about like, what is the impact going to have. And that comes down to like the people who know what people actually need on the ground. Cool.
I love that. Thank you. And I love thinking of it like a renaissance, because that's really what it is. I mean, it's like, these are things that we did for so long, for all of our existence, up until like, obviously there's been exploitation before that, but with the industrial revolution, and it's just accelerated. So I think it's just that renaissance of bringing these really natural, very humanistic principles back. I love that you use that word. I think that's a really cool way of looking at it. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thanks for your question. I appreciate that. Yeah, any other questions before we wrap up, or thoughts or comments? All right. Well, I'm just going to put my email into the chat, if you would like to get in touch. And I'm open to other collaboration ideas, or if you just want to chat and tell me your ideas. This is the best part of my job, is meetings like this, and learning from you all. I definitely learn from folks here, around different ideas you shared, as well as questions that challenge me to think more deeply about sustainability. And so thank you all for coming. And yeah, I wish you all the best, and hope our paths cross again in the future. And have a wonderful evening. I think even the fact that that we're all here at like 8 o'clock on a Thursday weekend night gives me hope, that like we care enough, to try to do something about this, and there's folks like us everywhere in the world, and so continuing in this spirit of determination and commitment to get this problem fixed and create the world we want to live in. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. It was so nice to meet all of you. Thank you, Trevor.
Bye, Brenda. Yeah,
Bringing us together.
of course.
Y'all have a wonderful evening. Y'all. Bye.
Take care.